In the shadowy corridors of history, some figures stand out not just for their power, but for the sheer terror they inspired. And few names conjure up a more chilling image than Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, better known to the world as Vlad the Impaler. His legend is so dark, so steeped in blood, that it birthed the most iconic vampire in literature, Count Dracula. But the real story of Vlad is arguably more terrifying than any fiction. This isn't just about a cruel ruler, it's about a man who turned brutality into an art form. A psychological weapon that shook the most powerful empire of his time to its very core. To understand the man, we have to understand the world that forged him. Picture the mid-15th century. Europe is a chaotic patchwork of feuding kingdoms and principalities, but to the east, a titan is rising, the Ottoman Empire. Led by the brilliant and ambitious Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, the Ottomans have just achieved the unthinkable. In 1453, they captured Constantinople, the 1,000-year-old capital of the Byzantine Empire, sending shockwaves across Christendom. With Constantinople as their new capital, renamed Istanbul, the Ottomans set their sights on the rest of Europe. Their path of conquest led them straight to the doorstep of a small, volatile region nestled between the Danube River and the Carpathian Mountains, Wallachia. Wallachia was a buffer state, a Christian principality caught between the mighty Kingdom of Hungary to the north and the ever-expanding Ottoman Empire to the south. For its rulers, survival was a constant, treacherous balancing act. And into this political tinderbox, Vlad III was born around 1431. His father, Vlad II, was the ruler of Wallachia. To secure his position, Vlad II made a fateful decision. He joined a prestigious order of knights called the Order of the Dragon, created to defend Christianity against the Ottomans. This is where the name Dracula comes from. In Romanian, Dracul means the dragon, so Vlad III became known as Dracula, which literally translates to son of the dragon. It was a name meant to inspire pride and strength. Over time, its meaning would twist into something far more sinister. Vlad's childhood was anything but ordinary. It was a brutal education in power, betrayal, and survival. At the tender age of just 13, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were sent as political hostages to the Ottoman court of Sultan Murad II, Mehmed the Conqueror's father. This was a common practice at the time, a way for the Sultan to ensure the loyalty of vassal rulers like Vlad's father. If the father stepped out of line, the sons would pay the price. For years, Vlad lived in the heart of the empire he would one day fight. He was a prisoner, yes, but a privileged one. He received a first-class education in science, philosophy, and the arts. He learned to speak fluent Turkish. Most importantly, he learned the inner workings of the Ottoman military and its political structure. He saw their strengths, and he also saw their weaknesses. But this education came at a terrible psychological cost. He was isolated, far from home, living among his family's enemies. He witnessed firsthand the absolute power of the Sultan and the brutal methods used to maintain it. He learned that in the Game of Thrones, mercy was a weakness, and fear was a powerful tool. While his younger brother Radu adapted, even befriending the young Mehmed, and eventually converting to Islam, Vlad seethed with a quiet, burning hatred. His resentment for the Ottomans grew with each passing day, fueled by the humiliation of his captivity. This period forged the iron will and ruthless pragmatism that would later define his reign. He wasn't just learning from his captors, he was studying them, waiting for his chance to turn their own methods against them. That chance came after years of turmoil. His father and older brother were brutally assassinated by rival Wallachian nobles, or boyars, backed by Hungary. Vlad, with Ottoman support, briefly seized the throne but was quickly forced out. It would take him several more years of exile and political maneuvering before he finally secured his rule over Wallachia for the second and most infamous time in 1456. Now, as the undisputed voivode, or prince of Wallachia, the son of the dragon was ready to unleash the fury he had stored up for so long. His kingdom was a mess, plagued by corruption and the constant infighting of the powerful boyar families who thought they could control him just as they had controlled his father. Vlad had other plans. His first order of business was to consolidate his power and send a terrifying message to anyone who dared to challenge him. He invited hundreds of these rival boyars and their families to a grand Easter feast. The nobles, arrogant and unsuspecting, arrived in their finest clothes, ready to celebrate. But Vlad wasn't interested in celebration. He was interested in retribution. During the feast, he confronted them, accusing them of treason, of plotting against his family for generations, and of being responsible for the death of his father and brother. He asked them how many princes had ruled in their lifetimes. Some proudly boasted of having seen dozens come and go. Vlad's response was swift and horrific. According to the chronicles, he had the older boyars and their families seized on the spot. Outside the hall, his soldiers had prepared long, sharpened wooden stakes. One by one, the nobles were impaled. This method of execution was deliberately slow and agonizing. It was designed not just to kill, but to terrorize anyone who witnessed it. For the younger, healthier boyars, he had a different fate in mind. He marched them 50 miles overland to the ruins of a cliff-top fortress overlooking the Argesh River. There, he forced them into slave labor, commanding them to rebuild the castle with their bare hands. Many died from exhaustion, but the castle was rebuilt. It would become his personal stronghold, Panari Castle, a fortress built on the bones of his enemies. The message was clear and absolute. Loyalty to Vlad was the only path to survival. Disloyalty would be met with a fate worse than death. Wallachia now had a master, one who ruled not through diplomacy, but through sheer, unadulterated terror. With his domestic enemies eliminated, Vlad turned his attention to the external threats. Wallachia's economy was being strangled by Transylvanian Saxon merchants who ignored his trade laws and supported his rivals. Vlad's response was predictable and brutal. He led a series of lightning raids into the Saxon towns of southern Transylvania. He burned villages, rounded up merchants and their families, and brought them back to Wallachia. And there, on the hills overlooking his capital of Targoviste, he created his most infamous spectacle. He had them all impaled. Not randomly, but in organized geometric patterns. Men, women, and children were executed, their bodies displayed for all to see. He created what would become known as the Forest of the Impaled. These stories, spread by terrified survivors and amplified by the new technology of the printing press, cemented his reputation across Europe. He was no longer just the son of the dragon, he was Vlad the Impaler. But for Vlad, this wasn't just mindless cruelty. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare. He understood that his small principality could never match the military might of its neighbors. He couldn't win a conventional war, but he could make the price of attacking Wallachia so horrifyingly high that no one would dare try. He was using terror as a deterrent, a national defense strategy built on nightmares, and his biggest test was yet to come. The mighty Ottoman Empire, led by his childhood acquaintance, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, was growing tired of Vlad's defiance. For years, Vlad had refused to pay the jizya, the annual tribute the Ottomans demanded from their Christian vassals. It was a bold act of rebellion. Mehmed, fresh from his conquest of Constantinople and busy expanding his empire, initially sent envoys to remind Vlad of his obligations. Vlad's reception of these envoys has become the stuff of legend. The story goes that when the Ottoman diplomats appeared before him, they refused to remove their turbans, citing religious custom. Vlad, feigning a desire to help them uphold their tradition, praised their devotion. Then he ordered his guards to permanently fasten their turbans to their heads with nails. Whether this event actually happened or is part of the growing black legend surrounding Vlad is debated by historians. But true or not, it perfectly captures the spirit of his defiance. It was a personal, insulting, and unforgettable message sent directly to the Sultan. The final straw came in the winter of 1462. Vlad led a daring surprise attack across the frozen Danube River, deep into Ottoman territory in what is now Bulgaria. It was an audacious move. His men, disguised as Ottoman soldiers, moved swiftly through the unsuspecting lands, wreaking havoc. Vlad himself later wrote a letter to the King of Hungary, boasting of his campaign's success. He provided a chillingly precise body count. We killed 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians, not counting those we burned in their homes or whose heads were not cut off by our soldiers. He sent the Hungarian king 2 large bags filled with the severed heads, noses, and ears of his victims as proof. This was more than just a raid. It was a declaration of all-out war. Vlad had crossed the point of no return. He had personally insulted the Sultan, massacred his people, and challenged the might of the world's most powerful empire. Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, a man not known for his patience or mercy, was enraged. He began to assemble a massive army, one of the largest the world had ever seen. His goal was no longer just to collect tribute. It was to crush Wallachia, to wipe it off the map, and to personally deal with the impudent prince who dared to defy him. The stage was set for an epic confrontation, a clash between the conqueror of Constantinople and the Lord of Impalement. What happened next would shock even the battle-hardened Ottomans and forever seal Vlad Dracula's name in history as a master of horror. In the bitter winter of 1462, we will continue this story in our next video. Lay beneath a sheet of snow so pale and silent it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. The Danube River had only just begun to thaw, its dark waters breaking free of the ice that had carried us into Ottoman territory and back again. I still remember the way the frozen river groaned beneath our horses during that raid, as if warning us of the storm that would follow. Because after we crossed back into Wallachia, every man in Vlad's retinue understood one truth with absolute clarity. The Sultan would come for us. The villages near the river were the first to feel the tension. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys in the usual steady columns. Families burned their firewood sparingly, hiding their presence, afraid that a plume of smoke might guide an Ottoman scout or raiding party. Dogs barked at nothing, at shadows, at the wind, at the fear that spread faster than rumor. The sky hung low with clouds heavy as iron, and even the forests seemed changed. The wind through the bare branches sounded like distant whispering, "They're coming." Men fortified their homes with whatever they could find, rough-hewn logs, stones, broken carts. Women carried buckets of water to the ramparts, not for cooking or washing, but to douse flames when the enemy arrived. Old men sharpened scythes and rusted axes, swearing they would not live to see another Ottoman flag rise over their village. We were a small land, a narrow strip of country pressed between mountains and river, but every frozen field felt like sacred ground, and every field felt threatened. In Târgoviște, Vlad's capital, the preparations took on a harsher tone. Soldiers drilled in the courtyards from morning until the last light of day. The sound of steel striking steel echoed between stone walls like a heartbeat. Vlad himself rode constantly between the towns and highland passes, inspecting fortifications, interrogating scouts, and issuing orders with a voice that carried no doubt, no hesitation. But even he could not stop the whispers. Some said the Sultan was assembling an army larger than the one that had taken Constantinople. Others claimed the Janissaries themselves had sworn to drag Vlad back to Istanbul in chains, alive or dead. The boyars, those who survived Vlad's earlier wrath, muttered bitterly that we had provoked the empire beyond reason. Among the common soldiers, no one denied what was coming. We could feel the weight of it, like the air before a storm. I remember one night in particular, a few days after our scouts reported immense troop movement near the Danube. The sky was a dark violet, and the cold stung the inside of my nose when I breathed. The campfires were small that night, their flames hooded by shields to hide the light. Even our voices were low. No one spoke of honor or glory, only survival. I sat beside my horse, rubbing warmth into its muzzle, when a fellow soldier muttered, "The Sultan will bring the whole world with him." His hands shook despite the fire at his feet. Tens of thousands, maybe more. I didn't have the heart to argue. Deep inside, I feared he was right. For all our courage, for all Vlad's brutal resolve, Wallachia felt like a lone wolf standing on a frozen plain, hearing the distant rumble of an approaching army it could never outrun. The air itself seemed to change as the days passed. The birds left early. The forests grew unnervingly quiet. Even the river seemed to flow heavier and darker, as if it carried the message of what was coming straight from the Ottoman heartlands. Vengeance. We had struck first. We had drawn blood. And now the greatest military force of our age was stirring, massive, relentless, inevitable. We braced for its arrival, knowing it would not be a battle for victory, but a struggle to survive the wrath of an empire. Across the Danube, as the last weeks of winter bled into the pale light of early spring, the Ottoman Empire began to awaken like a giant disturbed from sleep. News travelled fast in those lands, faster than any messenger we could send, faster than fear itself. Word of Vlad's raid spread from village to fortress, from fortress to garrison, until finally it reached the marble halls of Edirne, where Sultan Mehmed II held court. The Sultan did not rage. Those who served close to him later whispered that he simply fell silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he ordered preparations for war. The mobilization began with the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the empire. Trained from childhood, shaped by discipline so absolute it bordered on fanaticism, they were the steel backbone of every Ottoman conquest. I had seen them in my youth, during my years as a hostage. Their silence, their precision, the coldness in their eyes, they were like living extensions of the Sultan's will. Now, tens of thousands of them assembled in their barracks, polishing their helmets, sharpening their swords, preparing to march north. Behind them moved the Sipahis, the armoured cavalry of the empire, riding out in long columns that shimmered like a river of steel beneath the sun. Farther still came the Akuncha raiders, fast and relentless, known for leaving nothing but ashes behind. Engineers followed with carts of siege equipment, tools and timber. There were cooks, smiths, imams, physicians and scribes. Even herds of goats and cattle were driven alongside, for armies of that size devoured the land as they travelled. And this army was enormous. Some chronicles claim Mehmed brought 60,000 men. Others say 100,000. Some, more dramatic still, insist the number reached 150,000. Whether any of those numbers are exact hardly mattered to us. In truth, even half that force would have been more than enough to crush Wallachia. Compared to them, we were a flicker of light standing against a rising sun. Caravans of supply wagons rolled out of Edirne and across the empire, a vast road network. A logistical feat unmatched anywhere in Europe. Ottoman commanders rode with lists in hand, ticking off names of soldiers, horses, weapons, tents, tools. Orders were relayed in Turkish, Greek, Arabic, Serbian. The empire spoke in 100 tongues, but all of them carried the same message: march. By the time the trees began to blossom along the Danube, the Sultan's preparations were nearly complete. Mehmed himself rode at the head of the army on a massive black horse, armoured in plates engraved with Quranic verses and imperial insignia. He was not an old man, only 30, but he had conquered Constantinople at 21, and the weight of that triumph followed him like a shadow. To the Ottomans, he was a visionary. To us, he was a force of nature. As the army advanced, villages emptied before them. Roads shook beneath the hooves of war horses. Birds scattered from the treetops in great flocks, fleeing ahead of the march as though even the creatures of the forest understood the catastrophe that was coming. From our side of the river, our scouts watched the horizon grow darker each day as the Empire's banners multiplied. Red fields with the white crescent and star snapping sharply in the wind. They returned to Vlad pale-faced, describing row after row of tents stretching farther than the eye could see. When one scout approached me, his beard crusted with frost, he whispered, "It is like the earth is moving, as if the land itself is uprooting and marching toward us." That was how it felt. The Ottomans did not advance like an army. They advanced like a continent. Every step they took bent the world around them. And we knew they were coming for revenge, not negotiation, not tribute, not compromise. The Sultan wanted to crush Wallachia, to tear it apart root and bone, and to silence forever the prince who dared defy him. We watched the distant fires of their camps burning on the far bank of the Danube like a second sunset. We counted the moments until they crossed. By the time the first Ottoman scouts appeared along the Danube's southern bank, Vlad had already accepted a truth most rulers would never dare to face. Wallachia could not win by strength. We had no vast armies, no endless supply trains, no disciplined ranks of janissaries ready to march at a single command. What we had were forests, mountains, frozen rivers, and a ruler who believed fear was a weapon sharper than any sword. The day Vlad called his captains to council, the air inside the hall felt heavy, as though even the walls understood the weight of what was coming. Snow clung to our boots. Everyone smelled of horses and smoke. Vlad stood before us, not dressed in ceremonial armor but in his worn riding coat. Mud splattered on the hem. His beard was untrimmed, his eyes sunken from sleepless nights. There was no ceremony, no greetings. He began with a single sentence. "The Sultan is coming, and he will not leave until every one of us is dead." Silence. No one disagreed. Then he laid out his orders, not with the calm of a strategist, but with the cold fury of a man preparing to survive the impossible. Burn the fields before the Ottomans reach them. Poison the wells along every southern road. Kill every animal that cannot be moved into the mountains. Destroy the bridges, block the trails, fell trees across every usable path, leave nothing but ashes and winter behind. It was a brutal strategy, one that ensured our people would starve if the war dragged on. But Vlad knew the alternative. If the Ottomans fed on our land, they would grow stronger with every village they occupied. His only chance was to turn the country itself into an enemy, one that consumed everything, friend and foe alike. Some of the boyars muttered against him, calling the orders madness. One silver-bearded noble spat the words, "Are we to destroy our own homes to spare them?" Vlad's expression didn't change. "If you prefer the Sultan's mercy," he said, "you are welcome to kneel before him when he arrives." No one spoke again. Over the next days, the land transformed under Vlad's command. Villagers gathered what little they could carry and fled toward the mountains. Young men and women dug trenches, carried stones, hammered crude barricades into place. Children stuffed rags into cracks of doors and windows to hide the glow of candles at night. And yet, even in this desperate unity, the old cruelty of the age showed its face. I remember one afternoon near Târgoviște, watching a group of soldiers loading families into wagons. A boyar's son, arrogant, broad-shouldered, the type raised to believe his place in the world was higher than everyone else in S, barked at the women to hurry. "Move faster," he shouted. "A slow woman slows the whole country." An older soldier beside me muttered, "They act as if the Ottomans will spare them just because they shout louder." But the boy kept yelling until one of the women stumbled in the snow, dropping her bundle. He laughed at her, laughed even with the shadow of the Empire bearing down on us. That was the world we lived in. Even at the edge of annihilation, men clung to their pride, their arrogance, their belief that women existed only to obey and endure. Wallachia's greatest threat was Mehmed's army, but its oldest poison lay in its own culture. Vlad, for all his ruthlessness, tolerated no bickering in these days. He dealt with incompetence and defiance swiftly. When a minor noble refused to evacuate his estate, claiming it was unmanly to flee, Vlad had him dragged outside, tied to his own gate, and left to choose between burning his home himself or being burned inside it. He chose the fire. His screams carried across the hills for minutes that felt like hours. That was Vlad's world, and in his mind, mercy was a luxury for nations that could afford it. We could not. As winter receded and the land darkened into early spring, reports came daily. Ottoman scouts seen near the river, enemy cavalry crossing in small groups, ships gathering on the far bank. The Empire was drawing closer. And still, Vlad pushed us harder. He rode from village to village, his cloak snapping behind him, barking orders to torch barns, to drag wagons into ravines, to collapse tunnels and wooden bridges. He expected us to fight, not as soldiers, but as shadows, invisible until we struck, then vanishing into the forest like ghosts carried by the wind. One night, as we sat sharpening our blades beneath the twisted limbs of a bare oak tree, Vlad rode by and stopped beside me. His horse snorted steam into the cold night. "Remember this," he said quietly. "The Ottomans come for blood. We will give them fear. Fear lasts longer." His voice was calm, deadly calm. And in that moment, looking into his eyes, I understood the truth. Vlad was not simply preparing us for war. He was preparing us for a kind of survival that stripped away every comfort, every illusion, every softness. We would not fight like an army. We would fight like a wounded animal, desperate, cunning, and willing to do anything to survive. The deeper we moved into Wallachia, the clearer Vlad's intentions became. He did not plan to meet the Ottoman army in a single, glorious clash on open ground. No, Vlad intended to turn the entire country into a labyrinth of death. A place where the land itself fought for us, where every hill, every forest, and every forgotten path would bleed the enemy dry long before they reached our capital. I witnessed the first preparations near a cluster of villages along the Argesh River. Men and women worked side by side in grim silence, hauling cartloads of supplies into mountain passes and storing them in hidden caches. Grain, smoked meat, tools, arrows, spare bowstrings. These were not supplies for soldiers. They were for the forests, for the hills, for the war that would be fought far from any fortress walls. Vlad stood at the center of this storm, issuing orders without hesitation. His eyes burned with a cold, disciplined fury, a mind calculating terrain, distance, and despair as if they were weapons sharper than any blade. He called it defensive devastation, but to us soldiers it felt like preparing the country to tear itself apart in order to survive. One of his captains protested that burning fields and poisoning wells would doom our own people. Vlad's reply was a whisper colder than the winter wind. Better our crops burn than feed the Sultan's army. Better our wells die than sustain our conquerors. Many of the villagers agreed. They knew what Ottoman armies did to the lands they occupied. They knew what happened to the men taken for labor, the women marched in chains, the boys carried off to become janissaries. If starving the enemy meant starving ourselves, so be it. The alternative was slavery. Still, the devastation weighed on us. The smell of burning crops clung to our clothes for days. Entire orchards, older than any living man, were chopped down and set ablaze. Wells that had quenched generations of families were filled with carcasses of dead livestock so no Ottoman soldier could drink from them. It was a war of hunger, a war of exhaustion, a war of shadows. On the narrow roads between villages, we placed massive wooden stakes, sharpened at both ends. Some were buried in pits, concealed under leaves and earth. Others were driven into the ground to form barriers that would force the Sultan's armies into bottlenecks. The worst ones, those meant for ambushes, were smeared with pitch and dried blood from previous battles. I still don't know whether that was for intimidation or superstition, but the forests became something else entirely. Vlad ordered entire groves cut down in strategic locations, creating sudden clearings where none had existed before. These would serve as open killing fields, places where archers could fire from the tree line and then melt back into cover before the enemy even realized what had happened. At night, the work continued under the moon. The sound of axes and saws echoed eerily through the hills, but everyone understood the urgency. Every tree felled was another obstacle between Wallachia and the empire that sought to consume it. And then there were the traps, hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes, tripwires attached to deadfall logs, narrow mountain trails rigged with boulders that, with the pull of a single rope, could crush dozens of men in an instant. I remember helping a group of villagers set one such trap above a narrow gorge. They worked with the quiet efficiency of people who knew that their survival depended on the death of strangers. It was in these days that I finally understood the true meaning of Vlad's war. He did not fight like a prince guarding his throne. He fought like a man who believed his country was being stalked by a beast far larger than himself, and that the only way to survive was to make the beast bleed with every step. Some of us questioned whether it was enough. Could any amount of traps, scorched fields, or poisoned wells stop the might of the Ottoman Empire? Could a land so small truly resist a force so vast? But Vlad believed, and as the days passed, the villagers believed. And eventually, even the most frightened soldier among us began to believe, because belief was the one thing we had that the Ottomans did not. We were preparing for a war we were never meant to win in open battle. A war of patience, a war of suffering. A war where the land of Wallachia itself would strike back. And when the first Ottoman scouts finally crossed the Danube, they found a country waiting for them like a silent, starving predator. By early spring, long before the Ottoman vanguard even reached our borders, fear began creeping through Wallachia like a sickness. It moved in silence, slipping into the huts of shepherds, the barns of farmers, the mountain hamlets where news arrived slower than the seasons. But the fear was real, and it grew with every whisper, every rumor, every distant echo of movement along the Danube. At first, the stories were small, fleeting shapes seen at dusk, strange tracks in the mud, the sudden disappearance of livestock. Villagers blamed wolves, then bandits, then spirits of the forest angered by the destruction we had wrought. But before long, the truth became inescapable. Ottoman scouts were already combing the countryside. Their arrival did not come with trumpets or banners. They moved like hunters, not soldiers, silent, swift, disciplined. They traveled in small groups, wearing the dark, layered armor of the Sultan's frontier troops. They appeared suddenly, interrogated families, seized supplies, and vanished again before the nearest Wallachian riders could even be summoned.